I'm Dr. Mulbar, and I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers today. Adrian Hernandez, who's been on the faculty for, I guess, since, 2000? 2002. Saw the light and came from Texas to come help us here. He's done a lot of health services research and actually and really led the charge here on Ascend HF. Our other speaker is Craig Reist, who's a project leader in cardiovascular research and had the task of keeping all the balls in the air and not having any of them crash and burn. So they're going to tell us about what it took to do Ascend. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks. So it's my pleasure today to talk about Ascend, and really for this audience, I want to talk about some of the issues we faced with Ascend in terms of the concepts of pragmatic clinical trials. Certainly this group has heard a lot about the importance or need for doing pragmatic clinical trials, and we like to think that they're commonly done, but in reality that's actually turning out to be a very uncommon situation, and in Ascend at least, we actually have the perfect storm in terms of being able to do a pragmatic clinical trial for lots of different reasons. So first, let me say what is not a pragmatic clinical trial. And so many people think that when we talk about a pragmatic trial, that's easy life. We're not going to be doing this. We're not going to be doing that. It's going to be very simple, straightforward. We're just flipping a coin, giving a patient a treatment, and then whatever time point we ask whether they're dead or alive. And at least some view this is what Craig's life was throughout the trial. And what you'll hear from Craig later today is that really it wasn't like this. This was a different trial. This was not while he was on Ascend. But what is a pragmatic trial? It is about defining priorities. So really understand where the key clinical questions that we have to address and figuring out what's the most efficient way to address that. And one thing when you consider this is you realize not everything's on the menu. And so just an example of that is this is one of our famous Ascend HF dinners in Vienna. And so we went to this, what we thought was a very fancy restaurant with our sponsor. And what we wound up ordering is, the classic Vienna sausage. And what we got is hot dog, mustard, and sauerkraut. And as you can see, unlike the sister trial that was going on at the same time with J&J, Rocket, there's no wine here. There's, we had water. We didn't even have napkins. So this is just what we realized. We prioritize what the needs of the trial is, and we're willing to take other limitations here. So today I just want to talk a little bit about what the background and rationale for Ascend, kind of the behind the scenes of what was going on in the trial. There's lots of different stories in terms of how the trial was developed, how it almost died at least 3 times it got resuscitated. Defining kind of what was thought of as the operational quality for Ascend, what actually happened here, and then, importantly, the final answers for nasiratide, and then also end up with some discussion about using Ascend as an example of pragmatic trial in this day and age, and how we should really, as a group, as an organization, really push to have pragmatic clinical trials more common. So one thing that, just to make sure everyone understands this, that heart failure is very important. It's very common. It happens a lot. It's one of the few areas that continues to grow in cardiology as well as just in the U.S. And so this just shows that the unmet need is still there in terms of hospitalizations for heart failure. Outcomes are poor, and so some of our work here using Medicare data with Leslie Curtis shows that 30-day mortality, readmission rates, as well as at 1 year is still very poor. And so if you consider just the 30-day readmission rate or mortality rates, 11%, and goes up to 36% at 1 year. And then in terms of readmission rate, which is a common focus currently for healthcare, readmission rate for heart failure is 23%, and at 1 year it goes up to 67%. And then if you contrast where we are, the state of evidence in terms of acute heart failure as well as versus acute coronary syndrome or acute MI, the number of hospitalizations per year are about the same. The inpatient mortality is about the same. 30-day readmission is about double for patients who come in with heart failure. The guidelines are still very much lacking for acute heart failure compared to acute MI. And while there have been updates in most recent guidelines to include a paragraph or two on acute heart failure, really, if you look at the evidence behind these guidelines, it's pretty thin. The largest trial to date before ASCEND was just over 4,000 patients, and really that wasn't necessarily an acute heart failure trial. While that was a therapy that started in the acute phase, it was really a chronic trial, and so then you go down to an order of trials that are around 1,000 patients, at least as Rob characterizes a large phase 2. And then if you just do Medline citations, you can see that really the area of acute heart failure has a lot to grow in terms of an evidence base. And this just summarizes the past history of acute decompensated heart failure. These are just the main large randomized trials. And when I say large, meaning over 400 patients. So not terribly large in the context for most people here. And some of these trials actually were pivotal trials done here by this group. So if you consider FIRST, OPTIME, ESCAPE, VERITAS, really important trials that the DCRI led with Chris O'Connor and Rob Califf. And then in terms of other trials, VMAC was the largest trial of nasiratide that got its approval, 489 patients to get FDA approval. So really striking in terms of what was needed back then. There are these other trials, REVIVE, SURVIVE, EVEREST, and then also PROTECT, which was a larger acute heart failure trial of over 2,000 patients. So if you add these numbers up, it's just over 12,000 patients. And then if you show this information to, say, Bob or Ken Mahaffey, they kind of think of this as the usual acute coronary syndrome trial, that this is a small area for us right now. And if you consider just the state of therapy for acute decompensated heart failure, that in 1974 there was a major review article published in terms of what's the treatment, state-of-the-art treatment, include diuretics, vasodilators, oxygen, and inotropic therapy. And really, there's nothing that's changed since then. And so actually in a few weeks, you'll see a publication from the Heart Failure Network answering some of the questions related to diuretics. But again, there's not too much else there. Now, the story behind Natracor and nasiratide is pretty interesting. It was a clinical development program out in California that had a very interesting promise in terms of being a new therapy that's gone through trials for an indication for acute heart failure. It was approved by the FDA in 2001 as an IV treatment for patients with acute heart failure who had dyspnea at rest or with minimal activity. And recently we got to chat with the CEO of, the former CEO of SIOS in terms of how this happened. And essentially the reason that they had this indication was just the usual going to the FDA, asking them what it would take to get a drug approved. And he said, well, we want to show that it has some very early effect, so the early dyspnea improvement at 3 hours, and that it's not very harmful. And not very harmful, meaning like that there, at least in a larger trial that had been done before, that there was no issues in terms of mortality. And so they really only had to do a nearly 500 patient trial, and they also wanted to have some kind of comparison to nitroglycerin, which actually is not the standard of care for acute heart failure, but they did have a third arm in there. So they went on to market. They had a wildly successful marketing campaign. It extended outside the hospital doors where they're actually using nasiratide several times a week in an outpatient setting, and that caused a lot of attention. They even got CMS to approve reimbursement or a coverage decision for hospital-based infusion clinics. So it's almost like dialysis several times a week. Patients would come in and dollars were made. But then people started paying attention in terms of the cumulative evidence of nasiratide. There had been other smaller trials that had been done with various comparisons. And when Jonathan Sackner-Bernstein did a meta-analysis, he was able to show that there was a short-term risk of death after treatment with nasiratide. He then went on to show that there was evidence for worsening renal function. So not only that if nasiratide didn't kill you, the implication was it killed your kidneys. And so this really took off in terms of attention for the drug, especially with the sparse evidence base it had before. And then, importantly, Eric Topol publicized the outpatient infusion clinics, showing that while this has been going on in the clinical community, it really had no evidence or verification that this was a useful therapy in the outpatient setting. This, of course, led to lots of attention from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. Chris O'Connor was actually part of the expert panel that gave advice to SIOS, chaired by Dr. Braunwald, saying that you needed to do a large clinical trial to understand the effectiveness of nasiratide as well as the safety profile. And that was how ASCEND was born. So the one thing that is always striking is that while there may be a pivotal trial that shows that this is a therapy that should be given to every patient, that there's something that shows that there's remarkable mortality improvement on a therapy, it takes often 10 years or more to actually get it used in practice commonly. But when you have fear in the public, especially using media, what happens then? You get a rapid drop-off. And so if there was a way to translate this fear-based evidence and using the media to evidence-based guidelines for best care, this would be remarkable. And then the nasiratide story is that it's the classic fear that actually drives clinical practice. And so you can see here that with the publication of the meta-analysis that there was a marked drop-off in use of nasiratide compared to before. So let me just briefly talk about ASCEND in terms of study design. So there are several guiding principles that started out for ASCEND. One is that there had to be investigator independence with an executive committee and a very large steering committee. We had everyone and their brother under the tent in terms of the heart failure mafia. It was a large pragmatic trial model, focus, efficient study design, streamlined procedures, and simple follow-up. And so while this was something that was very good and very much aligned with the folks here at DCRI, this may not always be aligned with the sponsor. But in this case, actually because nasiratide sales had dropped off so much and that they were basically under the public scrutiny to do this trial, they wanted to do the trial, get done as fast as they could, and as cheap as they could. And so they were very much on board in the pragmatic trial model because they could see that there could be dollars saved in this model. And it was important to enroll clinical heart failure. So again, since the main question was around safety as well as effectiveness, and that the drug had been used in a wide range of patients, that the trial was designed to include that same wide range number of patients, that if it could potentially be used in that population, then let's go ahead and include it in the trial. And it would have to have meaningful outcomes. While there was some interest to really understand improvement in dyspnea and whether that was validated or how long that extended, we also need to have something that was also very meaningful in terms of clinical practice, such as mortality and readmission. And real-world treatment was important, so whatever physicians are doing as their usual care, they should do in the trial, and there shouldn't be limitations. And then also just to make sure that there's some type of giving back to the community, to the clinical community, to further the science in the field, is that it should have feasible sub-studies to drill down on certain components that are important, but wouldn't necessarily burden the sites. And this is what came out. Simply a design of patients who are enrolled with acute heart failure, randomized less than 48 hours from hospitalization to nasiratide or placebo. And there was a focus assessment at 24 hours to assess dyspnea at 6 and 24 hours, and then a 30-day visit to assess clinical outcomes, and then a telephone call for 180 days. So pretty simple, straightforward design. And I'll get back to the final answer in terms of results, but while that design was pretty simple, there was so much else was going on to make sure that that we actually did deliver important and clear data from the results of the trial, and most importantly, efficiency without eating a lot of steak along the way. So let me pass it on to Craig.
Thanks, Adrian. So you'd think I'd learn after 4 years of working with Adrian that when he says he's got a couple tweaks to do to the slides, that's not a good thing. But anyway, before I talk to you a little bit about operational quality and some things that we did from an operational perspective on the ASCEND trial that have since carried over to a lot of the new trials that we're currently working on putting proposals together for, I wanted to share with you a little bit the beginnings of ASCEND and how the trial first came to me. I recall it was late 2006, sitting in my office working hard as usual, and Lisa Burdam walks in and says, "Craig, I've got something I want to talk to you about. I think this is going to be a terrific opportunity for you." Since then, I've had sensors installed in the office so that when she comes in and says terrific opportunity, sirens go off, lights flash, so I know that that's an opportunity for me to run in the other direction. Yeah. But kidding aside, Lisa came in and talked to me about the ASCEND trial, and what I learned is that while SIOS was committed to doing this trial, they were committed to doing this trial as cheaply as possible, as Adrian has alluded to already. So some of the things that were going through my head were, well, can we actually do a trial this streamlined for this budget and get it done and have data at the end of the day that we're going to stand up to regulatory and clinical scientific scrutiny? The other thing that we found is that there was a lot of turmoil ongoing within SIOS. It seemed to be that it was a bit of a revolving door at that point in time, and we weren't sure when we picked up the phone to call our clinical or operational contacts we were going to get a person or get a phone message saying, "We're sorry, this number has been disconnected." I think we went through at least 3 or 4 lead physicians and 5 or 6 primary operations folks within the company. What we didn't know at the time and learned is that J&J was in the process of dissolving SIOS, so unfortunately for a lot of the people that we were working with there, their time was numbered, so to speak. As Adrian mentioned, there was a lot of uncertainty about the safety of this drug, and I remember we were sitting in a meeting and Caliph came in and the sponsor was there and he made the statement, "Well, I think we can enroll at least half the patients in this trial in North America." And I looked at Lisa and I'm thinking, terrific opportunity. Okay. I said, "Rob, have you looked at enrollment in North America in clinical trials lately? It's on the downside, and here we have a drug that potentially has got a mortality risk and is killing your kidneys, and we're going to commit to putting half the patients in North America." So anyway, we continued on, and there was always this concern that at any given point in time the DSMC may stop the trial. We had 6 reviews by the Data Monitoring Committee, so they were very involved in looking at the study. And I remember sitting there with Adrian wondering, are we going to get that phone call to continue, or are we going to get the phone call that it's time to fold up the tents and go home? And then second to lastly, who is this guy Adrian, and what did he know about clinical operations? I remember Lisa coming in and saying, "Oh, he's very young, he's very enthusiastic, he wants to get involved in the operations. I think it's going to be a really good match for you." And she was right about most of that. And with the exception of his poor taste in football teams in the Dallas area, he actually turned out to be a pretty good operational partner. The last bullet here kind of sums things up. I remember being on a phone call with my counterpart at J&J. We were talking about things we could do to get the sites energized, and where we could have our investigator meeting, what types of flashy site materials we could put together to get the sites excited. And they kept kind of discounting all these. "Well, Craig, I don't know if we can do that. I don't think we have the money to do that." And finally, after a couple of my suggestions, he said, "Craig, you do realize that ASCEND is the redheaded stepchild project here at J&J. This isn't the rocket trial." So I remember going home that night and talking to my wife and saying, "Well, it looks like I'm working on the redheaded stepchild trial." My daughter was in the room, and she said, well, Dad, what does that mean? What does that mean? Is that a good thing? I said, well, no, that's not a good thing. She goes, well, why is it bad to be a redheaded stepchild? I said, well, it's not really bad, Claire. It's just a saying. Well, I don't understand. What does the saying mean? And I had a long day already. I'm like, I don't know what it means. So I decided I better look it up and figure out what it means. And it actually dates back to early Irish immigrants. And I debated whether or not to show this slide, because when the surnames of the director of your therapeutic pod, the co-chair of your trial, and the head of the DCI are Mahaffey, O'Connor, and Harrington, you got to be careful about what you say about the Irish. But nonetheless, the origin of the phrase redheaded stepchild dates back to the early 1800s when Irish immigrants began arriving in America. They were at the bottom of the social scale at the time and lived in segregated communities. Then, like now, young men were having relations with young women before marriage. Sometimes the men were of Irish descent and the girls were not. This resulted in many out-of-wedlock children with that Irish red hair. When these young women did finally marry, usually to a young man not of Irish descent, the new husband was not particularly patient or sympathetic to the red-haired stepchild and treated them harshly. So herein lies the terrific opportunity that Lisa presented me with. So one of the things that we focused on throughout the trial are, because we had to do it streamlined, we had a pragmatic design. Throughout the course of the trial, we were constantly questioned in terms of how are you going to ensure quality in the trial? At the end of the day, is this going to stand up to regulatory scrutiny? And this pressure increased throughout the course of the study, and it got to the point where J&J and many other companies now are creating whole groups to just look at quality and pile on processes and increase the things that you're documenting. And while some of that is good, I think a lot of it is simply added cost, added resources with little added value. And so we kept having to sort of fend off this, in our eyes at least, unnecessary work. And I remember going to Rob and saying, Rob, you got to help us out here. Or at the end of the day, are we going to be able to stand up and present this trial? And he reminded me that, Craig, if you just answer 4 simple questions about a trial, and you can answer yes to these, then at the end of the day, you've got a pretty good product. And those 4 questions kind of evolved into what we call our guiding principles and are now incorporating in many of the trials that we're currently working on or hope to soon to be working on. And they're things that we've been doing all along. We just hadn't necessarily been showcasing them in a way to demonstrate to our sponsors and or regulatory agencies that this is what we were doing. So I'll quickly just list them. It's, have you enrolled the right patients with adequate consent? Were randomization and blinding done correctly? Did the participants receive the assigned treatment, and is the primary endpoint data complete and correct? So at the end of the day, if you can say yes to all those things, you've done a pretty good trial. And Rob felt so strongly about this and the whole concept of the pragmatic trial design that he approached J&J about meeting with the FDA to sort of defend this concept of the pragmatic trial, convinced them to set up a meeting, and a group of us went up and met with the FDA last October to use ASCEND as sort of the case study for this concept of a pragmatic trial. Would the agency buy into a streamlined approach to monitoring, doing a lot of in-house data surveillance? And at the end of the day, if we presented this to them and said this is what we did, would they agree that that was a job well done? And thankfully, they pretty much said yes. This is what they want to do. They recognize that companies are doing a lot of extra work, are reading a lot more into what they're recommending than they necessarily want them to, and encouraged us to work with our pharma sponsors to meet with the FDA prospectively to not only look at protocol design, analysis plan design, but really develop a quality plan and talk about it up front to say, here's how we're going to define quality in these trials, and if we do those things and measure them and account for all of the guiding principles, at the end of the day, we should be fine in terms of obtaining regulatory approval. So I want to share with you some of the things that we did on the ASCEND trial that speak to these guiding principles, and the first being, did the right patients get randomized? So we did things like ask on the case report form, did the patient qualify? You get some sites that say, well, no, they didn't. But beyond that, we took a look across the data, and with the help of our stats and data team Adrian and myself created what we call operations reports, which are now being called quality surveillance reports, that in a systematic way look across the data and help identify areas where there may be some concern. For this trial, that was, did the patients meet the inclusion criteria of acute decompensated heart failure? And it's not as simple as putting a query on a variable and saying, you know, did you have this? Because in many of these trials, it's a combination of things where you need to have shortness of breath and or something else and or something else. So it becomes quite complicated just to do that via data queries, and it really takes a statistical surveillance approach across the data to determine whether or not the patients met the criteria. So we did that throughout the course of the trial, and each month we'd review listings of patients that didn't qualify. That allowed us to connect with sites early on, you know, let them know, hey, this patient didn't qualify, you know, put corrective action in place if we needed to. At the end of the day, you know, we feel we did a pretty good job. There were a few patients, as in every trial, that didn't qualify, but by and large, the vast majority of patients did meet the criteria, and those that didn't early on, we were able to put some corrective action in place. We still do go out and do on-site monitoring, although it's a small percentage relative to some of the early phase studies. We only do about 15% on-site SDV of patients, so that was done at each site. We do have flexibility in our monitoring plans to increase that at high enrolling sites or sites where we do find issues, and that was done on a couple occasions. At the end of the day, we ended up monitoring 25% overall, so we were above our goal of at least 15%. We also look at 100% of the consent forms to make sure all the patients are actual patients and have adequate consent. We looked at the operations reports to make sure that across different geographic regions, the demographic data was comparable. We wanted to make sure that when we were enrolling patients in the U.S. versus India, that you're comparing apples to apples and not comparing apples to oranges. Since acute heart failure is somewhat hard to diagnose, and there's differing opinions of patients that have acute heart failure, BNP samples are really the only measure, in a sense, of a lab value that you can use, similar to what we've done in some of our ACS-AMI trials, looking at cardiac enzymes or troponins as qualifiers. We put in a core lab for select countries and had them send their samples there. We didn't do this in a prospective way, in a sense they didn't have to wait for the value to come back because we needed the patients enrolled in an acute setting, but it did allow us monthly to look at patients, or rather sites where, you know, they were putting in patients with normal BNP values, and then, you know, educate that site that this isn't exactly the patient that we want in the trial. And we did have a couple examples of sites that seemed to show up more times than we expected them to, and we're able to re-educate them on the type of patient that we wanted enrolled into the trial. We also did some, to move on to one of the other guiding principles, did the participants get the right treatment? We had our stats team monitoring randomization, and we learned many years ago to have, not to have blind faith in your IVRS system to say that, well, we programmed it, it's going to assign the right patients the right drug. I think that's a recipe for disaster. So we had Gretchen and Amanda looking at the assignments of kits and making sure that the randomization scheme was working properly. We also had an EDC query posted such that the kit numbers were fed directly into our clinical database in a somewhat blinded way, and that the site couldn't see the drug kit number that was assigned by IVRS. They then had to go in and put a number in of the kit that they dispensed to the patient. If the two matched, great, no query. If they didn't match, they'd get a query saying, please verify that this is the kit that was dispensed to the patient. In some cases, they made a transcriptional error. They corrected it. It then matched. But in other cases, we did find that, you know, they picked up the wrong kit off the shelf instead of the one that was assigned. That allowed us to then go back and work with that site to improve their processes to make sure they were getting the right drug to the right patients. We looked across our operations reports at things like bolus use. It was optional in this trial to use the bolus dose of nasiratide. A lot of sites did use it. Many more did not. We identified that the primary reason was physician decision, which doesn't tell you a whole lot, so we chose to create some additional data fields in there to specify and really get a better handle on why physicians weren't using the bolus dose. Collected data on the median infusion to make sure that that was in the appropriate time frame of what we were expecting. Monitored things like permanent discontinuation of drug to make sure that there weren't sites that had too high of a rate of permanent discontinuation, and also looked at the incidence of various adverse events that would cause early discontinuation of drug. Found some things via on-site monitoring that were somewhat to be expected, and worked with sites to re-educate them on proper running of the infusion dose, as well as paying attention to the weight-based dosing. And then the last section there talks about our stats surveillance, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how that was set up. But what we were able to identify via this process was that there were a certain number of sites that were running the drug for exactly 24 hours or exactly 48 hours. And that wasn't really the spirit of what we wanted the sites to do in this trial. We wanted physicians to treat the patients until they were symptom-free. So it was only via this stats surveillance that we were able to look across the data and see that, wow, there's very little variability in this data point here. It looks like every patient gets drug for exactly 48 hours. And by and large, we found that when we contacted these sites, that's exactly what was happening. They were writing an order to run the drug for that period of time instead of clinically assessing the patient and stopping the drug when they were symptom-free. So we were able to re-educate some of those sites on how we wanted them to dose the study drug. So what did we do to look at whether or not the primary efficacy data was complete and correct? And this first bullet is really the key to a lot of what we do in the mega trials group. It's making sure that the sites have their data in and clean and maintain their data in and clean throughout the course of the trial. None of what I just talked to you about can happen if the data is not in there and available for analysis. So we set the bar pretty high in terms of what our expectations were for data clean, and the sites pretty much adhered to that. We weren't afraid to give them what we like to call an enrollment holiday if they got too far ahead in terms of putting patients in versus getting their data in. We'd stop them for a little while, let them get caught up on their data, then if appropriate, reopen them to enrollment. We also looked to make sure there weren't any late visits or open queries greater than 30 days. The reason we've done that is we found that even if a site has 95% of their data in, if they have some data that's missing for extended periods of time, those are often the patients that turn into your loss to follow-ups or patients that have withdrawn consent but you don't have them documented as such. You want to be able to kind of jump on those issues early on, try to find those patients, get them back in the study, back into being followed. So making sure that nothing is too outstanding was a key driver of the operational approach as well. We did have the weekly data status and radar reports, which basically enabled us to do that. And then we focused our monitoring plan such that our 15% SDV was really weighted towards our hospitalizations, because that's where our endpoints are coming from, is the patients that were rehospitalized. So we made sure that at least 50% of all rehospitalized patients were monitored. That way, if there are problems with getting that data in, we'd have a greater opportunity to address it by focusing our monitoring toward where our endpoints are occurring. So again, monthly review of our operation reports, looking at aggregate event data across the trial, enabled us to identify a couple of things. One is that we had a lower than expected use of guideline-based meds. What we didn't want to happen at the end of the day is for people to be able to criticize the outcome of the trial, because let's say, for example, we did see a benefit. Then was that benefit because the patients were not being treated per guideline-based meds? Is it, how transferable is that result to what we already know works for this patient population? So we took some action and put in a plan to query sites that weren't discharging patients on guideline-based meds, and saw an increase in the use of those throughout the course of the trial. The other thing that we were able to observe was a lower than expected event rate in Central Europe. What happened was the endpoint for the trial had to do with rehospitalization within a certain period of time, and a lot of the patients in that region were being hospitalized for extended periods of time. So if you're looking at rehospitalization, one way not to find it is to keep the patients hospitalized through whatever that time point is. So we didn't have a lot of events coming from that area, and when you don't have a lot of events, that's essentially just diluting your sample size. So we made the decision under the recommendation of the executive committee to stop enrollment in that region and just continue on in other areas where we were seeing what we had hoped for in terms of the event rate. As I mentioned, our DSMC was actively involved looking at the data every 1,000 patients and making recommendations on whether or not we should continue. Fortunately for us, each time they came back with a positive review as continue as planned, so we marched ahead toward completion. And our clinical events committee was very involved in terms of looking at events directly in the case report form. The clinical event coordinator had direct access to the ECRF. He would go in, look at events that had been triggered, could run reports on the status of what was available for review, could post queries asking the sites for more detail on more information. And this idea of integrating as much as possible into the clinical database really made that process a lot more efficient, as opposed to having to request that a CRA go out and ask for source documents or ask for more information. He could go in, post a query, and usually within a couple of days get a response, get that case to the committee and through review in a pretty quick fashion. So I mentioned the statistical surveillance, and this is something that we actually started to do several years ago as a way to try to identify potential fraudulent activity. And what we did was we looked at sites that had randomized at least 10 patients, and Adrian and I worked together to identify some key points where you might expect sites to kind of cheat or take shortcuts, and that might be things like lab values, the duration of the infusion, things like heart rate, some vital signs, and look across the data at a site level compared to a regional level and see what's the level of variability that you would expect. You would expect in these kind of trials you're not going to see a very tight window in terms of the data points, that there would be a certain degree of variability. Sites that were below that degree of variability were then flagged for further review, and in some cases we sent out a CRA to do additional monitoring to actually look at the data to see is there source documents to support these values, are they real. We did find the infusion issue that I mentioned previously. We were able to re-educate sites on that. So it's something that we've now tried to incorporate in a lot of our trials as an added measure of assessing the quality and ensuring that there aren't things going on that a monitor may not see. You can kind of miss the forest for the trees when you're looking at patients individually, but by looking across the data, you start to see patterns and identify trends that maybe are indicative of some things that you want to look further into. And this just shows some of the results of that effort, and we were able to follow up with these sites and do some additional monitoring and review to ensure that the data was legit. And finally, we did spend a lot of time making sure that we were very aggressive at finding lost to follow-up patients. We have wording in the consent form that allows us to use the services of an outside agency that works with us to find patients and reconnect them with the study sites. We have ongoing reports that look at patients or look at the number of patients that have withdrawn consent. If we see that there's too many or more than we'd expect at a certain site, we can work with them to make sure that they're screening patients appropriately. And we often tell them that it's not quantity, it's quality in terms of the patients you're putting in. Enrolling 50 patients and having 10 of them withdraw consent is actually doing us more harm than good. So we're able to monitor that closely and limit the number of patients that withdrew by taking action early on. So what happened in terms of enrollment in the trial? As Some of the milestones that were hit are listed on this slide. We did become the largest trial ever for nasiratide, and actually the largest trial ever for acute heart failure. The biomarker sub-study was launched in April 2008. I think Adrian will share a few analyses that are underway with you and a few plans for some future analyses with biomarkers. Our final patient was enrolled August 15th of last year. Last visit, 30-day visit, was September 18th, and we were able to lock the database in a little under a month, which was pretty impressive for a trial with this many patients and this much volume. I left this in because I don't often get to show an enrollment curve where the actual is so far ahead of the projected, so this is my bragging slide that we were actually able to meet our goal and stay ahead of projections throughout the course of the trial. This is the distribution of patients in the world. We ended up with just over 7,100 patients in 30 countries at almost 400 sites. You see that we didn't quite reach the 50% that Rob wanted, but we did a pretty good job. 45% of patients in a clinical trial in North America these days is, you don't see that very often. Other regions that were well represented were Asia Pacific, and that largely represented enrollment in India, who enrolled over 1,000 patients. This is just the country-by-country distribution of enrollment. And you'll see here are top enrollers for the trial. You're going to see a theme here with a lot of patients in India and a couple other sites in North America represented. This top site is a site in Southern California that far and away was our leading group all along and ended up with 252 patients at the end of the day. So my final slide before I hand things back over to Adrian is just a comparison of what we would consider a very pragmatic approach with the SIN versus what was done on J&J's somewhat sister trial at the time, Rocket AF, and that just the volume of information is drastically different when you look at the number of SAEs that were reported, just the number of events, con-meds, AEs, number of visits. And most importantly, or maybe not most importantly, but also importantly, the difference in cost. And I think what we were able to demonstrate in the ASCEND trial is that we can do these trials in a streamlined fashion with a streamlined budget and get an answer and really be able to stand behind the data and feel good about the fact that at the end of the day, we could put a quality product out there that's going to stand up to both clinical and regulatory scrutiny. So with that, I'll turn things back over to Adrian. Just wanted to acknowledge that it really takes a village to get these trials done. Listed here are some members of the DCRI project team that worked extremely hard on getting to the point we are today. So thank you for all of your efforts, and listed also our ARO partners. This really was a collaborative effort with some of our friends and other North American academic centers.
All right. Thanks, Craig. And so just last 10 minutes or so, I just want to give you some highlights for kind of the main answers here. We'll probably be able to do an annual conference on ASCEND data with analysis that we have planned with the help of Karen and her group, as well as some important sub-studies. But in terms of the main result here, actually, the 30-day death and heart failure hospitalization was 10.1% for placebo, and it was 9.4% for nasiratide. So it was not significant. But if you were to ask anyone back in 2007 what they would find, what they expected, their actually expectations was that either A, we would not enroll a single patient, and B would be that the DSMB would stop it at 1,000 patients. And even if we completed the trial, that what it would show would be that everything trended towards harm for nasiratide, and all the patients would be outside of the U.S. So we're actually able to show that all those myths or dogma was incorrect. The other co-primary endpoint was related to dyspnea at 6 and 24 hours. And so one of the things about the drug was that while the FDA they valued early improvement in dyspnea at 3 hours, and that's what the prior designs were focused on, there's still questions about the sustainability or duration of dyspnea at 6 and 24 hours. And what we saw here is, just for simplicity, that in the placebo group, there was moderate or marked or moderate improvement in dyspnea, 42% versus 44.5% at 6 hours, and at 24 hours it's 66 and 68%. And so while the p-values here are nominally small, 0.03 and 0.007, they did not actually meet our pre-specified criteria because we had two co-primary endpoints. Interestingly enough, we've just gotten reviews from a journal on the main manuscript, and the statistician, Carrie, unbelievably said that I didn't understand why we actually split the alpha here since the endpoints are unrelated. So that's an interesting story that we'll have hopefully to tell in the future. And again, while it shows, it kind of demonstrates that there is some effect of the drug, if you will, that the effect is not very large in a very diverse population. And so there are lots of things that we plan to do with the SIN in the future. So first is, using the endpoints that we have to develop predictive models, really focusing on mortality, heart failure readmission, dyspnea, and then specific for Nasiratide, or the field of vasodilators in acute heart failure, is looking at the issues related to hypotension and renal function. So while Nasiratide, there may not be a lot ongoing in the future, there is current still use of Nasiratide in clinical practice. There is actually another trial in the Heart Failure Network that's using Nasiratide in one of the treatment arms. And there's actually, interestingly enough, novel natriuretic peptides are being developed, as well as novel mechanisms to deliver drugs that may be similar in a more chronic fashion. So we think that the use of a SIN will be actually helpful in terms of not only acute heart failure, but also for the roles of acute therapies in heart failure. And then along those lines, we plan to do analyses to look at a change or clinical course of journey of a patient early on at 6 and 24 hours, discharge, as well as 30 days. There's an important biomarker sub-study being led by Mike Felker here, as well as Wilson Tang at Cleveland Clinic, to understand kind of the traditional markers that we have, but also, more importantly, to look at new or novel markers, especially in partnership with the folks at Kannapolis. And then there's other sub-studies that we were actually able to get funded through J&J Genetics. It's actually probably the largest DNA repository in acute heart failure, with over 3,500 patients with DNA samples. And importantly and unusual in this environment is that J&J is a great partner in terms of actually continue on research in this line regarding genetics. A lot of times sponsors have difficulty sharing this resource or continue on the scientific work in that area. But maybe because Nasiratide's life cycle is ending essentially in terms of commercial promotion, that actually it really opens up the field for further science. And then there's actually important sub-studies in terms of respiratory function. It's ironic that we have a 7,000 patient trial, but we actually have no way to really have a validated measure of dyspnea for the field. So we may learn information from there. Health economics, which is being led by Shelby Reed, and actually has important implications for the field in terms of, what do companies do, or what should be done in terms of development, and what are the important endpoints that people should focus on. And then just other interesting things related to things may not be directly related to acute heart failure and Nasiratide, but of general interest in terms of environmental factors in heart failure. And at the end of the day, this is what Caliph has pushed on us to do, is to develop a textbook for acute heart failure. So a few years ago, Chris O'Connor and others edited an acute heart failure textbook. It's actually pretty amazing that there are about 20 or so chapters in there with the thin evidence base. But really trying to use SEND as a backbone to develop acute heart failure. And so there are many plans in terms of looking at the different areas, and then also exploiting things that we can here that we can't normally do. So because there's actually such huge variation in care for acute heart failure across the world, we can actually exploit that variation to really understand perhaps what is the best care. And then also importantly, SEND was actually a unique model for actually improving quality of care within a trial. As Craig noted, this is something that we implemented in the trial that's very common in U.S. clinical practice, but not necessarily in other areas. So just to end up, as Craig mentioned, that we were a little fearful when Rob told us that he'd convinced the FDA to have a meeting to use ASCEND as a case example for pragmatic trials. And so we actually loved at that time, throughout the course of the trial, being under the radar, that J&J and everyone else was so focused on Rocket. It was actually a pretty good time for us to be under the radar. And while we didn't get the Kobe beef, it was okay not being in the spotlight all the time. So there were many of us here, as well, of course, at J&J when they got the good news that Rob had a meeting for them at the FDA. And I just want to share the questions that Rob put forth using the usual Socratic method that the FDA likes. One was, does the FDA agree that there's a motivation in doing pragmatic trials? It's because we have too little evidence to inform clinical practice about the most effective use of medical products or treatment strategies. And so really trying to push them to kind of go out eventually and have a published guideline or a policy that, A, there's a need for pragmatic trials because we have such little evidence for what we do in clinical practice every day. And then also to get them to define actually what it is a pragmatic trial. So while that's something that means something to this group here, it may mean something very different for others. And then what sponsors really look for is, what does the FDA care about, or what's a regulatory agency care about? And so one step is trying to get them to define that. And what Rob had put forth is the goal is to provide a result in an environment as close as possible in the real clinical practice. Realizing, of course, anytime we go through a consent process or some type of selection, it may not be exactly real world, but as much as close as possible. And then also importantly, realizing that, a pragmatic trial is not for everything, that you have to have some evidence of what the safety profile is and that there's enough information available for the drug or device so you can understand the standard risk profile, as well as to understand what may be issues that you should actually focus in on a clinical trial. And then important characteristics that are desirable for a pragmatic trial. So in terms of design, so making sure that there's not intensive inclusion or exclusion criteria that requires additional tests that are not clinically available. Using the uncertainty principle that if it's close, you should randomize. Really, if there should be if there's any uncertainty or equipoise about the best treatment, it would be good to randomize a patient. And then a key thing in terms of data collection, keeping the primary data to a minimum that's really clinically available. And then importantly is to collect serious events in a systematic fashion. So focus on the key important things, but do it systematically. And then other things in terms of procedures, making sure it fits with real care, and then monitoring should be focused because I really want to focus on what the important issues are for the trial, so it's actually a tailored approach and having a quality plan outlined at the beginning. And then while there's such routine to have a pre-specified statistical analysis plan and a protocol, it's not necessarily always routine to have a pre-specified thing for quality. And so another question he's pushing forth was should a plan for measuring quality for the trial be reached, not only as a trial concept, et cetera, but again, to use everything at disposal for monitoring quality and having that pre-specified. And then lastly, everyone gets fearful of auditing, and that's what commonly sponsors say is that, well, they are collecting this not because it's important, it's because they don't want to get some ugly letter from the FDA with a few digits behind it that says that they're going to go on the death penalty if they don't address this. So having the FDA focus their auditing efforts and on the quality plan that's pre-specified and submitted, so not changing course during the middle of a trial, that you stick to your guns just like you would for a statistical analysis plan. So those are kind of the questions that we presented to FDA. We still will need to do follow-up work to really continue pushing forth this idea. So it's very early in the game. So in conclusion, we just want to say that pragmatic trials are possible still in this era. And it does more often require convincing the sponsors. What we heard from FDA actually is that they're very much okay for doing pragmatic trials, but what the sponsors don't necessarily get is that the FDA is okay with that. And that these trials can be used for addressing effectiveness in the real world and be a resource for the future. But really, this is going to take important strategies and new policies developed to align regulatory agencies, not only the FDA, but also outside the U.S. agencies such as EMA, sponsors, investigators. So with that, I want to thank you all for your attention. I won't bore you with our song, but this is just another evidence of what we have to do to make a trial run, is that we can't afford entertainment for any of our meetings, and so we actually had to sing "O Canada" at some of our meetings. And then one last comment for those who remember, February is Heart Month. American Heart Association is having a number of fundraisers this month. Tomorrow, you can witness the co-principal investigator for ASCEND, Chris O'Connor, in a sumo wrestling event at the Searle Center. So he is in the final match. And so if you have time and just need a few chuckles, feel free to drop by the Searle Center to see this major event. So with that, we're happy to answer any questions.
Please wait for the mic as we're being recorded.
Craig and Adrian and the whole team, this was a truly amazing effort and presentation. And I'd just like to make a comment rather than ask a question. I'm really struck that although you pitched this for this conference as the example of a pragmatic trial, which it was, you could easily describe your trial in terms of the operational things that you chose to do as a sterling effort of what FDA and other people now in the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative are talking about as quality by design. And you have demonstrated ahead of time what the consensus has been leading to within City, that this is exactly what you have to do. Your 4 principles, deciding up front what's really important, but more so figuring out what you're going to do, what those specific operational steps were that you described so beautifully, Craig, and assuring the scientific quality, and then seeing the kind of scientific questions you're going to be able to ask with follow-on work. This is just an amazing example, and it's just, I think that you've implemented something people are talking about. And by the way, we heard indirectly about your FDA meeting. FDA assumed, well, it was at Duke, we must know about everything. And they were so impressed. The impression I got was they were very impressed. And the juxtaposition of Rocket and Ascend in many of these questions is really front and center in people's minds right now. So congratulations. I'm really proud to be associated with the institution that did this. Thankfully,
well,
you were right. It was a great opportunity, and he took advantage of it.
Thanks, Judy. And actually, a city effort is something we continue to highlight with some of our other sponsors, that this is something we hope becomes actually reality, that there is something, because a sponsor will want to see a specific guideline that hopefully the city effort will actually translate.
By the way, and I'll just add this as an apparent, this is just my opinion. I actually think that missing point for the sponsors to realize that this is okay is the reassurance that if there is agreement up front on what's important and what you are going to monitor, and you know, you guys did central statistical monitoring too, another principle everybody's looking at now, that they could be reassured there won't be any, you know, at the end of the day, DSI comes out and looks at things that you didn't even agree were important in the first place. Right. And you're seeing a change within the Division of Scientific Investigation led by Leslie Ball that understands this fundamentally. So I think there's hope.
That's good.
Other questions? I think there are, to follow up on Judy's comment, a number of opportunities for additional papers on the process of doing the statistical process control in clinical trials. You know, even just why 1/4 of the average standard deviation. What brought you to choose that? So.
Yeah. Well, the easy answer is because that's what Gretchen told us. But
it's how many we could visit.
No, I think you're right in terms of, you know, that we're hoping that the team has actually been engaged with all these different things as well as our ARO partners. There's a lot of interest, especially to tackle some of these issues and put out knowledge or scholarship and publications on these important things. So that's another plan.
Great. Other questions? Thank you very much.